send
All right.
here.
All right. Got it. So hi, everyone. Welcome to Global Education Therapy's third webinar, Raising Bilingual and Multilingual Kids. I am Christine Law. I am an OT. And actually today we have a special guest, which is Sarah Fowler, who is one of our lovely speech therapists. Thank you for being here today, Sarah.
Thank you for having me.
Great. So we're going to go ahead and get started. But before we do that, we're going to go over our sponsors and partners. So we are sponsored by Remfrey Education Consulting, who is our special education consultant who helps schools as well as families get the services they deserve. We also work with Hemispheres Academy, which is a 100% online school for global mobile parents and students. And they make sure that you get the education that is tailored to the child's need. We are also newly sponsored with Embrace Behavior Change. So Embrace Behavior Change is by Shreya Ham, who's a behavior specialist and the founder. She provides behavioral coaching for the entire family. So parents and children work with Shreya to create a step-by-step plan to respond to behavioral, educational, and relational challenges at home and school. If you're interested in our sponsors, they are actually all on our website, so go ahead and check them out when you have the time. And of course, we are associated with Safe Passage and Senya. All right, so what are we reviewing? So we are going to review the myths and facts of multilingualism, different language methods that are used right now, tips and tricks to raise a successful multilingual child, when to consult a professional, and of course, our big FAQ, which has been brought in by questions from our Get families, as well as me, since I am also raising a multilingual child myself. All right, so the myths of the multilingual kid is that there's a speech delay. So most people think, oh, kids speak slower, don't worry, they're doing, they're speaking both languages. Some people say it's confusing for the child. And back in the day in speech therapy, they used to believe that kids should only learn one language, which was fairly controversial and now is not true. And it makes language learning, but also learning harder. What are the facts? So the facts are that actually it expands vocabulary, it improves reading skills, and it helps children to categorize those words since they're learning it in so many different languages. What is typical for a lot of these kiddos is that for 1 to 6 months, there's a silent period. So while they're learning that second language, they're like sponges. They're just taking all the language in. So it might take them a while to be able to express themselves. There's also errors in code switching. So what that means is that sometimes they'll be speaking in one language and then they'll switch to another language. So for example, with some of people I know that some kids may be using English words and then they'll switch to German. So I remember I used to work with a kid that would say, where is the Hund? And fortunately, Hund and dog sound similar. So I was like, oh, dog. And I would hear that. Or with my son, for example, he knows the word again in French is uncle, but he can't really say it. So he says, ungen. But I know what he's saying, but he's mixing the words. And then Sarah, I would love to hear your input, how typical that is, but we'll go into that later in the FAQ. There is, of course, some stuttering. And sometimes when the first language isn't spoken that often, there's a loss of proficiency. All right. What are the type of language methods? So there's one person, one language, which I think is very popular, or OPAL, I think OPAL, as some people have called it. I don't know if you've heard that before, Sarah, right? OPAL?
Yeah, I have.
Yeah, okay. I thought I was making it up. So this is very typical in families where each parent speaks a different language, actually. So for example, one parent might speak English, one might speak Chinese. And so the English parent would only speak English to the kids, and the Chinese parent would only speak Chinese. So they're getting exposure, but they're hearing it from both from a native speaker. There's also heritage language as home language. So this is typically in families where both parents speak the same language. So for example, my husband and I, we both speak English. So we speak English at home with my son, but we live in France. And then in his crèche or his school, it's entirely French. So that's how we're doing that. And so what happens is that both parents speak their native language that they're comfortable with at home, and then their child learns the other language in the community. So I think what all of us are curious about, Sarah, and I would love to hear your input, are what are some tips and tricks to really help our bilingual, multilingual kids? What do you think?
Well, there are definitely a few things that you can do to help your child learn multiple languages. And one of the first ones is good for language learning in general. But what you can do is you can read your child's favorite books in not just one language, but in multiple languages. So if, for instance, your child really loves Sam I Am, finding that book in whatever language that you're trying to teach in addition to English, that can be really helpful because it helps them know the vocabulary in both languages, as well as grab their interest since they do love that book so much. You can also look for some books that have both English alongside with the language you're trying to teach. That can really help, again, with associating those different terms in both languages. And then you can also read aloud. This is recommended for any parent, regardless if you're teaching multiple languages. Having that input, that auditory input, can be very important for kids because reading it themselves is one thing, but hearing it from a parent is another thing. So that really does help them build that vocabulary that they might not hear in day-to-day conversation.
Cool. Yeah, no, that's really good to hear. And that's good to know because we try to read as much as we can. So thank you for making me feel better, Sarah. I appreciate
it. So another thing that you could do, I think what a lot of people get caught up on is, okay, well, how do we make this fun? Because we know that kids learn the best when they're having fun. So in that last tip, we talked about using their favorite book. That's something that you can use to help keep them motivated. This one, you can listen to music. Most kids love to listen to the songs. They have fun. Wheels on the Bus is very popular. And it can really give them that motivation to learn languages in a way that doesn't feel like learning. So what you can do is you can listen to their favorite songs in multiple languages. Again, similar to this for the books, it gives them that association between the two languages. And what's also very interesting about it is that science of the right side of your brain is responsible for the singing and musical aspect of things, whereas the left side of the brain is all the language. So what you're doing by increasing the input of these songs is you're making sure you're activating both sides of the brain, which gives them a better chance of picking up that new language. That melody that you're giving them helps them memorize some of those words and phrases in both languages.
That's really cool and really useful. And really I like that this is really helpful and not difficult, right? Because I think all of us with kids definitely have the set songs that our kids listen to. And so this is just an easy thing to implement. So thank you. That's really cool. That's really cool advice. All right, tip 3.
All right, so for the last one, you guys will be happy to hear this one, I think. But one of the things that can be important is, when parents are trying to teach multiple languages, I feel like sometimes they can feel like, oh, my language isn't good enough. I'm not learning that language as well as I'd like to. How am I supposed to teach it? Well, one of the things that could be helpful is if you have a caregiver who speaks the language that your child is learning or that you'd like for them to learn, that can be a great way to give your child more exposure, especially if you're not feeling as confident in your knowledge of that language. It also gives your child a need to speak that language in order to communicate with the caregiver. So this can be extremely helpful. And I do know that a lot of parents have been wondering, okay, well, I'm worried the nanny only speaks a certain language. Well, you can use that as a positive. So it can be very helpful to have a caregiver that's speaking that language.
Yeah, definitely. And I know for me, I'm definitely very insecure about my French. So that's kind of nice to know there are other strategies and ideas that are in place. So cool. Thank you, Sarah. All right. So I think the question that a lot of our parents always love to ask is, when should we see a professional? So when should we see a professional, Sarah?
So a lot of the times when we are teaching these languages, we want to make sure that we're listening to any errors in both languages. So for instance, when we're just speech and language are different things. First of all, I'll start out with that. Speech is talking about just the sounds that come out of the mouth. So when we're thinking about a classic lisp or not being able to say R's, that's what we're talking about when we say the word speech. So in reference to speech, when you see those speech sound errors in multiple languages, for instance, if your child has a lisp and you hear the S sound sounds more like a TH, Sarah instead of Sarah, you want to notice, is that lisp there in both languages, or is it only in one language? It can be a little bit difficult to determine that yourself. So you're welcome to head to our website to get a free 20-minute consultation, and we can look a little bit more into that individualized aspect of the speech sound errors. Because it can be hard as a parent to know, okay, well, is this an error in both languages? So we'd definitely be willing to help you with that. And now the language side of things. When we're talking about language, we're talking about how somebody expresses themselves as well as how they understand language. So we want to know, are they having difficulty learning words in both languages? Are they having trouble learning numbers in both languages? Are they having difficulties when they're a little bit older reading both languages? Do they have a hard time? One of the biggest things is rhyming. Can your child rhyme in both languages? This helps with phonics, which is a big term that I think a lot of parents hear and are kind of like, what is that? And that's being able to manipulate speech sounds in both languages, and that includes rhyming. So that might be something that would be a good key. But again, if you have any concern, parent intuition is extremely important. If your mind says, this seems unusual, I wonder if that's normal, and you find yourself Googling to try and figure out what's going on, make sure you contact a professional. Parental intuition is extremely important. Parents know a lot more than they feel confident in. And so again, if you feel like your child's not learning in the way that you think they should, it's best to contact a professional to be safe. The worst that can happen is they get a little extra help. Whereas if you wait, you may, lose that kind of the right time to intervene, because earlier the better.
Definitely. And thank you for just reinforcing and really encouraging our parents that they are the expert in their child, right? We're the expert in our field, but you're the expert in your child. So thank you, Sarah. That means so much. All right, so this is the exciting part. I think everyone's looking forward to the FAQ just because there's just so many questions, but I think we get so many different responses. So Sarah, as one of our speech therapists, I have many questions, but I think the first one, a lot of people that I know have asked me is that we both speak English, but it's our second language, right? Mm-hmm. Is it bad that we're doing this, that, we're not using Opal, that we're not using our native language, but we're using the language that we both speak at home? So are there any pros and cons to this?
So it's not bad at all. Children are definitely sponges, like we mentioned earlier, when it comes to language learning. So the more exposure to all the languages being learned, the better. It's helpful to tell your child, to kind of give them the vocabulary about which language you're speaking. Because if you're kind of intertwining them, it's just important to give them that language so they understand, okay, this word, for instance, dog, in English, we're talking about a dog, woof, woof. Whereas in Spanish, we're talking about a perra or a perro. So you want to make sure that you're giving that language. Like in English, we say dog. In Spanish, we say perra. So that can be really helpful, especially when you're giving that exposure to both of those languages. Giving that vocabulary to your kids can be helpful in distinguishing between the two.
Yeah, definitely. So even if you only speak that one language to them, it's still good to show them like, okay, these are the other languages, which kind of explains the second question, right? Mm-hmm. Which is how to be consistent. Because I think for me, thank you, this is helpful actually for me. So for me, what I do is with my French, I say the whole sentence in English first and then French. Is that okay?
That's a great idea. I love that. That's a great idea. And you can also say, really trying to add in anywhere you can English versus French, because what you're doing is you're helping your child. If they were in a situation where they needed to speak French, for instance, is, once they get older, when they have to, I guess this leads into one of those other questions as well. Mm-hmm. But if you're making sure that I think parents worry about confusing the child, or, okay, well, there are certain circumstances where you need to speak French versus English based on who you're talking to, like that code switching we're talking about. By giving them that language of this is English, this is French, you can help them code switch if there is a situation where the person they're speaking with does not speak French.
Right, right. Yeah, no, that's super helpful.
That makes sense.
And so, yeah, definitely, because you're kind of just teaching us ways to be consistent. Right. So besides that consistency of like making sure you say one thing in both languages, or saying this is what we say in English, this is what we say in French or Chinese or German or Spanish, do you have like another tip that, you know, to keep that consistency? Or are those like the best ideas?
Well, I think it's also, you don't want to be super rigid about it, right? You know, you don't have to say every phrase that you speak to your child in both languages, because honestly, parents don't really teach children to speak more than they teach them to smile, right? So some of the important things in language development are just the exposure. And so if you're exposing them to both languages, that is consistent. And so you don't necessarily have to do them both equally, because like we said, those kids are sponges. So depending, you know, you don't have to be as concerned about, am I giving them as much exposure to this language as I am to the other? You'll know what's the correct amount as a parent. Again, that intuition. So what you want to do is that you want to follow the child's lead for the most part, right? So you are using those books, you're using the songs, you're using, you know, all those different tools. That is consistent. Does that answer that question a bit?
Definitely.
Or would you like me to go on?
No, that definitely helps. I think I like the idea that you're using your intuition as a parent, but also you want to do what's natural in the home, right? Because if you make it too rigid, that's not natural. So I think that totally makes sense. Thank you.
One more thing I will add is that you want to make sure that you are exposing them to that language in a variety of circumstances, which is where it really is the go with the flow kind of thing. So you want to make sure, like, okay, for instance, if a child is learning Spanish at school, but they're not at home, they're speaking English at home, you do want to try and increase the opportunities for them to use Spanish to more than just outside of school. So again, that could be reading books, it could be listening to songs in Spanish, it could be even silly things like, okay, what did you learn in school today with Spanish? You know, trying to incorporate that with your child to create that conversation about the different languages, you know, when they get a little bit older and they're able to discuss that differentiation between the languages.
Definitely. Yeah, that's really helpful information. So another question, I don't know if this is a good segue, but I know that a lot of kids code switch. A lot of parents have asked me about code switching. So for example, I guess I'll use my example. When my son says encore, well, he's supposed to say encore, which means again, but he says again. Should I correct that? Should I let that go? What do you think is best in your advice?
So that's kind of a loaded question. It depends on the age of your child. So one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that there are speech sound norms for when a child acquires certain speech sounds, right? So if your child's saying
he's 18 months, by the way.
Yeah.
So it's pretty young.
Yeah. If they're making a mistake on a speech sound that they're not able to produce yet, based on normal speech sound development and acquisition, correcting them would be, you wouldn't want to correct them in that situation. What you can do is you can model it back to them and give them that example. So he says, encore.
Yeah.
Is what, So
so it's like an encore. It's like encore. It's the same thing. Yeah.
So what you can do is, instead of being like, oh, actually, we need to say this, can you say blank? You say the term. So, oh, you're saying, and then you say it the correct way. So you're giving them that auditory input, but you're not frustrating them by asking them to say something their mouth might not be able to make yet.
Right.
But you're still giving that example.
Oh, wow. Okay. Wow. That is good information.
Yeah.
Wow.
And that's,
never thought of it.
Yeah, sorry. That's when we're talking about speech specifically. I do want to mention on the language side of things as well. And it's kind of the same thing. So again, when we learn language, we acquire things at different rates. You know, when we're talking about learning verb tenses, or we're learning the use of pronouns or word order in sentences, we know that specifically in Spanish and in English, the word order is quite different, especially when we're talking about adjectives, which comes first or second. So again, what you can do is model it. You make sure that when you hear what they say, okay, I'm going to repeat it back to you in the way that is correct in that language, but I'm not going to sit there and force you to say it in a different way. Because again, children are sponges. We want to make sure we're increasing that input. Once they get a little bit older, maybe, you know, I'd say kindergarten, first grade, second grade, you can start thinking about, okay, how can I have a conversation with my child about what is correct in the sense of what they're saying.
Definitely, definitely. And I like that you're also bringing up that kids get frustrated. We don't want kids to be frustrated. You know, that emotional piece, which I think us parents kind of forget because we're thinking of so many things, right?
Yeah.
So that's a really good thing you mentioned that. I think the other questions, if we have time, actually, I'll let you pick the question, actually, Sarah, and then maybe if you, whoever's watching this, you know, realize you have more questions or things weren't really answered, please feel free to email me at Christine@globaleducationtherapy.com. I'm happy to answer that question. We can give resources, but we can also give you more information about us at Global Education Therapy. And if you want to talk to lovely Sarah more, I can connect you too. So we're always happy to work with our families. So Sarah, out of curiosity, what do you think is more important for us to know? Should we be concerned about accents, or, you know, as somebody who might not be bilingual, you know, what advice do you have? Which one would you like to pick?
Well, let's see. I might be able to do both real quick if that's possible. So
let's
what I wanted to say, don't be concerned about accents. What typically happens is that bilingual students do have an accent in one of their language often, and that's normal. Okay, so this includes even the little bilinguals, which I think is a cute phrase, but children who grow up with multiple languages in the home from birth, they typically in their first language will have some sort of accent where they speak in one language with a foreign accent. So there is typically that. And it's something where if that feels like it's important to you, I think what you want to think about is it affecting your child's ability to be understood by others? That's when you should be concerned about an accent. And if that's the case, accent modification is something that we work on in speech therapy. So that is a possibility. If it is something that is important to you, it's okay to contact a speech language pathologist about it. So that's kind of about accents. It's okay. Moral of the story. It's okay if they have an accent. And the last question is, again, when you're talking about you want a child who's bilingual, but you don't necessarily speak it, having a caregiver, again, that speaks that language, like we mentioned earlier, as well as thinking about what language is being spoken in the school. So if you're unable to speak that language at home and you're looking for a placement for your child in a school, you might want to look for schools that do speak multiple languages. That can be a really great way to expose your child to another language without you feeling super confident in teaching them that at home. And what you can do is that one of the things that could be so helpful is you can learn the language with them as well, because that's another way for your kid to feel like, okay, I'm learning it too. You know, my mom is learning it too. My dad's learning it too. My guardian's learning it too. We're all learning together. And that can help with even like kind of that family relationship if you guys are doing it together.
Yeah, no, definitely, definitely. Well, thank you for that, Sarah. I'm gonna have to finish wrapping it up because I know we have some time and stuff, but I do want to say thank you so much for your time today. What you've really brought to the plate today has been really knowledgeable for not just our families, but for me as someone who is also trying to raise a multilingual, bilingual kid. Thank you for giving us really pragmatic information, really great knowledge, but also just really great things to think about. So thank you so much, Sarah.
Yes,
really appreciate it. And once again, we are Global Education Therapy. Here are our sponsors. And if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to us. Have a great day. And once again, thank you, Sarah. Really appreciate your time today.
No worries. Thank you so much.
All right, great. So we can cut the recording.
Yep.